Welcome viewers. Today we will be discussing a short story by Temsula titled The Last Song. Now, first and foremost, we must keep in mind what the role of the short story is. The short story is different from poetry. In poetry, imagination plays a very important part, in fact, a very vital role, and with words and what they denote their denotative and connotative meaning, whereas the short story focuses on a smaller zone of life and it picks up what one can call a limited experience for depiction. But within this limited experience, it presents to us a complete worldview. It tells us about the society at that point of time. It tells us about the people, about their lives, about their society, about their culture. When you read a short story, keep in mind the fact that at one level, we have in our mind the question, what is really going to happen now? What is the story about? But also, more importantly, we look at the different groups of people that have been presented to us in the short story. We also look at the different cultural practices, beliefs of the people who are presented in the course of the short story. At times, the role might be a minor role, but it tells us a lot about the social segment to which that person belongs and about the society. It is in this context that we shall discuss the short story, The Last Song, from the northeast region of the state of Nagaland. We realize also that Temsula's account, as she presents, relates to, broadly one can say, the mid-20th century India. Here is a little bit of biographical detail about Temsula. She was born in 1945 in Jorhat, and she lived pretty much just till the other day. She died in 2022. Temsula took a very keen interest in the study of life in Nagaland, to which she belonged. And she was also known famously for being an ethnographer, a poet, a fiction writer. Temsula taught English literature in Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, as professor, and won several prestigious awards, which also included the Sahitya Academy Award. Temsula is known for her fearless appraisal of developments in Nagaland. Her writing bears what one can call an indelible mark of painful engagement with the situation in her homeland. It is the situation there that she presents in books that she wrote, such as Once Upon a Life, Laburnum, apart from a short story collection titled These Hills Called Home, Stories from a War Zone. The story that we shall discuss today, The Last Song, is a part of this collection, These Hills Called Home. These Hills Called Home cover a very troubled, difficulty-ridden area that is marked by various levels of oppression, cruelty, and insensitive handling of issues that pertain to the people and their lives. One of the most important aspects that one comes across in this book is that of identity in contemporary conditions. India of the mid-20th century is described vividly in the context of Nagaland. There is inequality, underdevelopment, economic scarcities, and this led to an unequal development and prevented certain communities from evolving a character of their own and enabling the people to enjoy, the concerned people to enjoy the benefits of security and welfare. Temsula O observes in this collection, and I quote, "Many of the stories in this collection have their genesis in the turbulent years of bloodshed and tears that make up the history of the Nagas from the early 50s of the last century and their demand for independence. But while the actual struggle remains a backdrop, the thrust of the narratives is to probe how the events of that era have restructured the Naga psyche. It was almost, she says, like a birth of fire." If we look at this title that tells us about hills that are home and a kind of war zone that the area has turned into, we think about phrases like the turbulent years of bloodshed and tears. What does this putting together of two different ideas signify? Temsula O is driving our attention towards a sense of pain, towards the tears that come with violence that is inflicted on the side of the oppressed. If we look at the short story, The Last Song, in it there is a girl child, her name is Apenyo, and she occupies the center of the narrative. As an infant, she makes a lot of noises, and these noises are initially, not very pleasant. They are the noises that any child would make. But whenever the mother would go to a function in the neighborhood and somebody would sing a song there, the child would also start making a lot of noises. And this act would amuse people, but at times would also annoy. As a result of this, Apenyo's mother would feel embarrassed and she would leave the function. She would also wonder that, maybe this girl has inherited this desire to sing from her father. Later, this would become a talent and the girl would be an exclusive carrier of this quality. This entire narrative revolves around singing that starts with a noise that is both amusing and annoying. And this forms the first part. The story can broadly be divided into two parts, this being the first one. The first part of the story is really long and takes up almost 80% of the story. The second part is much shorter and it forms 20% of it, but there is a reason why Temsula O has introduced the second part to this story. To quote from the story, "As soon as the singers took up a tune and gradually when their collective voices began to swell in volume and harmony, her daughter would twist herself this way and that and start singing her own version of the song, mostly consisting of loud shrieks and screams. The father, whose name was Zamben, was a gifted singer, both of traditional folk songs as well as Christian hymns at church. Naga traditional songs consist of polyphonic notes, and harmonizing is the dominant feature of such community singing." This quotation is very important. It tells us about how the girl who loses her father very early carries within her this desire to sing and also probably the gift of her father. The father is trained in both the traditional Naga songs, which are polyphonic, and also the Christian hymns. And both are, community singing in their own two very different ways. One is the church choir, and the other is the Naga community singing the folk songs together. This is important because it also tells us another thing about people of the Naga community, that a lot of them had converted to Christianity. In this story, there is also a shift from the old church to the new church, and events are located around this central movement. Temsula O lives her own life in behavior of the central character. She connects as author with this central character, that is Apenyo. Where Apenyo sings her song, Temsula O too, in writing this story, is singing her own song. The idealism that characterizes this young woman is the idealism that Temsula O also pursues in her own case. She is committed to fighting repression at different levels. What then does the last song symbolize? It is a story about Apenyo and her singing the song. It symbolizes Apenyo's choice when she grows up and she's going to sing at this particular event, which turns out to be a gut-wrenching event. She chooses death over her own safety. Like a lot of other peoples in the story, if Apenyo had run away from the scene when an armed wing of the state unleashed terror in the village, she could have been alive. Temsula O does not give us the reasons behind the violence, except for the fact that the state, through its functionary, decided to teach the population a lesson for supporting in some way the insurgents. The people were also pressured to pay what Temsula O calls a certain tax to the people. This logic is described only briefly, but the story is about the way in which we see great heroic fervor in Apenyo. Temsula O valorizes her as a hero, and it is through her behavior that she represented in full the anguish of the population and those related to her. Temsula O, in this case, we must ask, is also aware of her position as an intellectual. What, really speaking, we need to ask is the job of the intellectual. It is her job to represent the community of the Nagas. It is her job to raise and problematize issues. And she does this well through the form of the short story. As writer, Temsula O does not side either with the rebels who have taken to violent ways and also oppress their own community by demanding a tax of them, nor does Temsula O support the violence that is perpetrated by the state. In fact, Temsula O makes a plea for a humanitarian understanding of the situation. All these considerations, all these contradictions are inbuilt in the narrative. As discussed earlier, the narrative of this short story also tells us about the shift to Christianity. The central event in this story is about the leaving of the old church building and moving to the new church building, which has recently been constructed. People have participated and contributed towards the construction of the new church building. O projects it categorically that the question of resolution should rest with the people. It is at this particular event where the shift from one building to the other takes place that Apenyo sings her song. She's part of the choir and she leads it. And when one particular wing of the state, that's the army officers, they barrage in and inflict absolutely violence, complete violence that destroys lives and is brutal and inhuman. Apenyo depicts valor and heroism as she does not stop singing her song. The important thing for Temsula O here is the singing of the song. We need to ask, why is it that O keeps the singing at the center of this story? She keeps the singing at the center of the story because somewhere the singing signifies the belief in humanitarian values, the belief in love and peace. The singing is meant to resist and nullify the violence. As Apenyo continues to sing, the officers are shocked and they don't know what to do. The rape of the young woman, Apenyo, and also her mother is at the center of this story. The brutality, of course, does not end there. And the building is burnt. With it, a lot of people die through the burning of the building. Then we come to the question of what is to be done about the bodies, especially that of Apenyo and her mother. To quote from the story, though the whole village had embraced Christianity long ago, some of the old superstitions and traditions had not been totally abandoned. The deaths of these unfortunate people were considered to be from unnatural causes, and according to tradition, they could not be buried in the village graveyard, Christianity or no Christianity. When the question of what is to be done with the bodies of Apenyo and her mother, the question to be asked is, should it be done according to Christianity, a religion that the whole village had embraced long ago, or should it be done according to the beliefs of the Naga people? It is decided to arrive at some kind of compromise solution. And so, to quote from the story, today these grave sites are two tiny grassy knolls on the perimeter of the village graveyard. And if one is not familiar with the history of the village, particularly about what happened on that dreadful Sunday 30 odd years ago, one can easily miss these two mounds trying to stay above ground level. So it is decided that there is going to be a grave site, but there is going to be no stone there. So, what one sees are, as described in the story, two tiny grassy knolls. And where are they located? They are located on the perimeter of the village. So, if one did not know what happened on that dreadful Sunday 30 years ago, one can miss these two mounds trying to stay above ground level. We come back to the question of the singing. Right to the end of the story, the end of the first part particularly, it is the refrain of the singing that continues, and it continues to haunt the soldiers as well. Temsula emerges as a humanist who believes in dignity and courage. This dignity and courage is always there, but it emerges at these very difficult moments. In the story, it is an act of daring that O adopted through her writerly stance. When Apenyo continues to sing throughout this episode, throughout the story, right through the moment when she is dying, the singing does not stop. Somewhere it is also indicative of the persistence of humanity to exist and to assert peace. So, O as writer and narrator assumes two different roles. One is the writer who writes the story, performs the writerly stance. The second is that of the narrator who tells us the story. Temsula O also becomes a chronicler who presents the events almost as if she herself were present there. At the same time, the other role is of presenting a different narrator, one who did not see the episode but is reconstructing the sequence based on what she has heard. So, where the first part is about the real episode and what happened, the second part of the story is different. Here, to quote from the second part of the story, one of the boys asks her whether she is not feeling well and tells her that if so, they can come back another night. But instead of answering the question, the old woman starts talking and tells them that on certain nights, a peculiar wind blows through the village, which seems to start from the region of the graveyard and which sounds like a hymn. She also tells them that tonight is that kind of a night. So, in this second part, there is an old woman who is the narrator, where in the first part, we have the writer and there is a narrator. In the second, very brief second part, a distance is created between the writer and narrator. And as narrator, we have an old woman who tells stories to the children, the young children, boys and girls who come to her. On this particular night, she tells them that it is a peculiar night because on this night they hear a kind of song through the wind that emerges from the region of the graveyard. So she starts humming the tune and they all look at her with wonder. She seems to have transformed. She appears to be an entirely different person. The story tells us that she appears more alive and animated than earlier. So somebody asks her, there's a young girl who asks her, "What are you talking about?" And then she asks them, "You have not heard about that song? You do not know about Apenyo? Then come and listen carefully." And the story ends on the note, thus on a cold December night in a remote village, an old storyteller gathers the young of the land around the leaping flames of a hearth and squats on the bare earth among them to pass on the story of that black Sunday when a young and beautiful singer sang her last song even as one more Naga village began weeping for her ravaged and ruined children. The reminder of the Black Sunday, the event when the people of the village were shifting from the old church building to the new, people who were being punished in a sense for the way in which they were compelled to pay the taxes, the episode of the ravaged village, the rape of Apenyo, and her resistance to it all in continuing to sing the song is a story that drives home the message that what we need is a humanitarian stance. In the words of K.B. Wopo, by telling these stories, the plight of women is brought to the fore and their voices heard. Writings, therefore, have definitely created space for women in addressing their various struggles wherein they find themselves encountering different ideas and forms. The story is also very important for its depiction of the women. It's about a mother who brings up her daughter on her own. She has lost her husband early, but she does not marry again, despite so many people telling her to do so, and she brings up Apenyo. The episode about the Black Sunday is recounted by another woman, an old woman. The question that is asked is by a young girl. Temsula O clearly makes it clear that it is important to understand that the voice of humanity is to be located in the women. And in the days to come, it is the women who have an important role in bringing about peace. Apenyo's song is the song of peace and resistance. Thank you.